Hey guys, in this beginner's tutorial we are going to be painting a landscape of Jacaranda trees, which are these trees that grow in South America and also in Africa in some places, these beautiful purple trees. I'm going to be using Analinki watercolors here because I'm going to be using them in in-person classes, but if you're watching this online, you can use whatever watercolors you have on hand, but I'll be pointing these out just so that if you're using these, because it can be a little bit difficult to differentiate the colors, I can show you what we're going to use. So exactly, we're going to be using some of this phthalo blue here, some of the purple here, and some of the brown. So I'm aware that these all look exactly the same. So if you just think of it as the white is here, if we go 4 down on the left, these are the colors we're going to use. And we're also going to use a bit of the green. And we'll learn a teeny bit about perspective. So remember that when I am giving these demonstrations, I'm using darker pencil marks just so that they show up on the screen. But you should be making very light marks so that only you can see them. The only reason I'm pressing down harder is so that you can see it on the screen. But when you're doing these, they should really be as light as possible because you don't want to have to erase these marks. You'll damage the paper if you do too much erasing. So you're going to take a really high H pencil, and at this point we can divide our paper into more or less fourths. It's not going to, create a huge problem if these dimensions aren't perfect, but we're going to do a line down the bottom fourth, and then just a little bit up from that, we're going to do a dot. And this dot is going to be our, this is a horizon point, and that's our vanishing point. Now I'm just going to move this down to the side like this, so I'm making a triangle on both sides. And I'm also going to just go up like this. And this is going to show the trees kind of receding into the distance. And now that I've made these marks, I'm going to start plotting out my trees. So I'm going to have one coming up this way. You don't have to copy this exactly. You might want to do another line like right here, showing where the tree trunks start to branch off into, other branches. So for instance, when I move up to this point, now I'm going to just branch off into another branch. And this, like I said, this can be a little bit more abstract if you want. You don't have to kind of do perfect branches that are going any one particular direction. You don't even really have to plot this out with pencil beforehand. You can just go straight into it with your brush, but just for the sake of having a little bit of structure down, I'm just going to mark out some of these branches so that we have an idea of what the main forms are going to be here. So we'll have a couple branches just moving off towards the sides, a few coming up this way, and so remember the base of the tree is going to be hitting this line here, moving up here, more branches. The branches are going to get smaller and smaller as they recede into the distance. I'm just going to start putting down the trunks at this point, and the trunks are going to get closer and closer together as we move off into the horizon. So to the point where as they move off around here, we're hardly going to see the differentiation between them. And so this composition will have a few elements of perspective, both in using the vanishing point and also in the way that we use color. So as colors move away from us, when we're looking way off into the distance, they tend to get a little bit more blue and a little bit duller, as well as a little bit light. Colors tend to be richer and darker and sharper as they move towards us. So we're going to be taking advantage of that kind of trick of perception and doing these trees. The other thing we're going to keep in mind is that these trees are going to be casting shadows. Okay, so I've made some marks here. You don't need to commit to these marks, you know, it's useful to have a little structure just to, you know, guide you as you do the painting process. Now I'm going to wet down my paper. And what'll tend to happen is that, you know, for everyone doing this at home, you're going to be wetting your paper down a little bit differently. The good thing about this is we don't need to control all that much on this demonstration because we're going to be doing a layer wet on wet. So if your paper is wetter than, for instance, it ought to be, it isn't going to matter that much. All you need to do is adapt what you're doing to suit your page. So, you know, if your page is really wet and you start noticing the colors bleeding a lot into it, then you can adjust it. Now I'm going to mix up some of this green to start with. This is a really light green here. So if you're using, you know, proper watercolors, this will be a sap green. And if you don't have a green on your palette, that's absolutely fine. Just mix together some yellow and blue. And I'm just going to be dotting in a little bit of this green. Don't get too much of it on the composition because we don't want it mixing too much with the purples that we're going to bring in. We can bring just a little bit of it out like this. If you want, you can dot in some yellow as well, but this is just going to be the area where the light is coming through the branches. So not a lot of green, because if we add too much green, it's going to muddy up our composition, which we don't want. And now I'm going to mix together two different purples. So let's see, I've got a big brush here. I'm going to take the purple, which is right here. This is like a Windsor violet if you're using watercolors in tubes or pans. And then I'm going to take a little bit of the phthalo blue here. I'm going to mix a little bit of the purple into the phthalo blue to make a darker purple, and then for the more reddish purple, I'll just mix up a little bit more here. So sorry if that's not showing, but basically I've just mixed up a little bit of purple and then mixed it with a little bit of blue to add some variety in the color. And from here, this is the fun part, we just dot in the color. So some areas, like probably on the far side, I'm going to have more of that bluish purple, and other areas more of the violet purple. And everyone's is going to look a little bit different depending on how you do this, and that's absolutely fine. You might want to add a little bit more water to your paper if you want these to really kind of bloom. So, you know, for instance, if I add a little bit more water, the color is going to disperse a little bit differently. I'm going to mix up just some pure purple. If you want, you can also add a little bit of magenta or lighter red to your purple if you want some more reddish kind of values. You can absolutely do that. But this is super, super simple. I'm just dotting in color. And this is not necessary, but if you want, I'm just going to add in a little bit of red to my purple to make it a little bit more kind of pinkish as I move off into the distance, just to get some more variation in the colors here. Okay, and now, so just mixing a little bit of red into that purple, I am going to start to get some of the shadows. So where we have the base of each trunk, we'll have a shadow coming forward, and the shadow is going to be this purplish color. So mixes of purple and little bits of red. You might want to use a finer brush as you move towards the back of the painting, and also add more water to your paints because these are going to become lighter as we move back. Okay, adding a little bit more reds because colors also warm up as they move towards us. So I'm just going to have some warmer reds in the foreground, which is the opposite of the background. It's the area closest to us. And I'm going to put in just a little bit more green. You don't have to do this. This is just to get a little bit more variation coming in behind the trees. Oops, I've got a little bit of that on the branch. It doesn't really matter. We're going to getting more details of the branches later. And you'll notice that as your paints dry, especially if you're using pigment-based watercolors, they're going to get lighter. So at this point, you might want to start adding in more color over the areas that have already blended together. So just have fun with this. Mix, we're just mixing together the components of purple. So whether you just use purple out of the pan, you can absolutely do that and just differentiate the color with the amount of water. Or if you bring in some different tones by adding in more red and more blue to different areas, you can do that too. You can even experiment, if you want, with taking a paper towel and picking up some of this color, which will create a nice kind of bleaching effect. There are just like lots of things that you can do here because it's a fairly abstract composition. I'm just going to turn this light off so you can see it without the glare for a second. Okay, that's better. Maybe I'll keep that kind of without the glare. The color isn't exactly the same on the screen, but well, I'll have to put the light back on just so I can see this a bit. It's the winter as I am doing this, so it's unfortunately a little bit dark here to see otherwise. And just get a paper towel, and I'm just going to dab some of this in the back. Again, this isn't necessary. This is just, yet another thing that you can do. So I'm dabbing areas that, for instance, these petals might be catching the sun. Just another effect that you can play around with using this wet on wet technique to get some variation. All right, and now I'm going to take my hairdryer and carefully just dry this. That's why I have to be careful. You might notice like here all the colors going everywhere, which is fine, but you know, you want to have control over that, what you want happening. So I'm just going to actually let this sit for a second because the paint hasn't really like been absorbed enough into the page. So you want it to absorb a certain bit, so I'm just going to stop the recording before using the hairdryer. I'll just do this a bit here where it'll all blend together, but you can also make really like interesting effects with using the hairdryer and just how you direct these colors. So let's just let this sit for a little bit. And as we wait, let's mix together the color for the trunks. So we're going to get some brown here. And the trunks are going to be more or less brown and red mixed with a little bit of the purple. It's fine if it mixes in with a bit of the green as well. So let's just start here. Careful that your paper is dry enough when you start to move in the trunks. So the idea is that we're putting in paint over dry paper, so we don't want this like ballooning out into the surrounding flowers. We want to make sure that this is dry enough before we put in the trunk marks. But right now, this bottom part of the page is dry enough for me to start putting in the trunk. So that's why I've started here. Because with watercolors, one of the things that you're doing constantly is like, it's kind of like a puzzle where you're determining, okay, what part of the page is dry at this point, what part, you know, can I put paint on without it just bleeding out all over the place. It's just, you know, kind of like, if you think of it as a game, it's a lot less stressful. These trunks are going to get a little bit lighter as they move off into the distance. I'm going to add a little bit of red here too, because they just sort of are kind of like bleaching in the light. And then I'm going to add in a little bit of purple to that to dull that, so that red, purple, bluish, brown mix as we go off into the distance. And at this point I can come in and reinforce some of these shadows. So I'm just going to add a little bit of blue to my purple to make a dark purpley blue. And move in with the shadows under these trees. Remembering that the shadows will get lighter as they move off into the distance. So add more water to move off into the distance. Okay, and I'm going to get my hairdryer out now. Actually, I'm going to pick up a little bit of this color around here, just to get just a little bit more variation. All right, now I think it's ready to hair dry, and I'm just going to hair dry this, and then we can add in more detail to the trunks. So at this point, we can start with our fine brush to get the branches furthest away from us, and then move towards the front, just remembering that the branches are going to get thicker and more defined as they move towards us. So I'm just going to take some brown for this, moving off in the distance, and just going to add in some details. So just making little branches way off in the distance. I'm going to add some purple to that brown as I make the branches a little bit darker as they start to move towards us. Now I'm going to move to the other side, so just get these branches in the background. And again, adding in some more of that purple as we move towards the branches and the trunks closest to us. Okay, and now we can start to think about the tree trunks closest to us, which will be a little bit darker. I'm just going to get a few just branches way off in the distance here. And now I'm going to mix together some purple, and I'm going to get some ultramarine, so this one here. Add that to my purple brown mixture and add some brown there just to get a really nice dark defined tree trunk coming close to us. If you want to be kind of fancy about this, you can use a dry brush technique on the branch by just dragging a dry brush over the lighter areas to create a bit of texture. Just going to do that on the branches closest to me. So, you know, again, this is purely optional. It's just another way of adding a little bit more texture to your painting. Dry brushing is always a tricky technique to get because it depends a lot on your paper, on the brush you're using. And now I can come back in with that purple brown mix to get more tree trunks down. And you can kind of move the branches around any interesting shapes that your wet on wet technique with the purple have made, so that it kind of seems like they're coming through the flowers. So if you have like edges on one of these marks, go around it, kind of pretend like the branch is coming through it. Remember that with the trunk, using interchange between browns, reds, purples, and different blue combinations will just add more richness to your composition. going to make the shadows a little bit near me a little bit more intense. I'm just adding a little bit of red to them. Darkening up the shadow a little bit as it gets next to the trunk, so a little bit more blue, a little bit darker as we're closer to the trunk. Okay, and I'm just going to leave this here. I'll call it a day with this one. But if you want to work on this technique, you can just look up images of jacaranda trees or any other really avenue of trees. Just substitute purple for whatever the dominant color is, like green, for instance. Remember that technique for just doing the triangle in the beginning to show the perspective. And remember that the thing that's making this seem like it's going off into the distance is a combination of a couple of factors of perspective. So not just that triangle that we made with the vanishing point, but the fact that the colors are getting lighter and a little bit duller as they move off into the distance, and sharper and darker as they move towards us. So now my favorite part, I'm just going to take the tape off. By the way, you should be taping this down. I didn't pre-wet this paper just because I'm using pretty cheap paper, so it can't really take that much wet on wet, so I didn't pre-wet it, but you might want to pre-wet your paper before doing this. And there you go. So I hope you enjoyed this exercise. Thanks for watching.